the newsagents.
Doors! Oh, police! Show me your hands! Show me your hands!
That was the moment that Martyn Blake, a police officer, shot one single bullet from his semi-automatic gun into the head of Chris Kaba, who he feared was going to ram his way out of a hard stop in Streatham in South London. That was in September 2022. This week, the police officer was unanimously cleared of murdering an unarmed man.
It was highly unusual for a murder charge to be brought against a serving police officer in a context like that. The verdict has deeply upset Chris Kaba's family, but that it was ever brought to trial has infuriated so many police officers up and down the country. So what are the rights and the wrongs of this case? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
If you look at the newspapers this morning, following the verdict in the case of Chris Kaba's shooting by an armed police officer, I mean, it really is a case of you pays your money and you takes your choice. Metro, gun cop cleared of murder. The Daily Telegraph, why was police hero charged? Ask MPs. The Guardian, Met officer cleared of murder after shooting unarmed driver in head. Well, the Times goes down the middle and says, anger on all sides as Met officer cleared of murder.
Yeah, well, last night we had Mark Rowley, who's the most senior police officer in the UK, saying that the system holding the police to account is broken. And I think that gives you a sense of how many people are frustrated with this whole context, the whole trial. The family feel they've been let down because they didn't get justice for their murdered son. The police officer and his family feel it was absolutely outrageous that anyone was ever put on trial for murder when he says he was defending his colleagues and defending the lives of the British public. The IOPC talks about the case being of significant public interest, which is why they then referred it, essentially to prosecutors for a murder trial. And the CPS is standing by their decision to prosecute, even though the jury in this case only took 3 hours to acquit Martyn Blake, the officer at the centre of this. And so you could say it is the perfect result, or you could say absolutely everybody is upset with how this was prosecuted in the widest sense.
Well, let us hear now from Chris Kaba's family. This was outside the Old Bailey after the not guilty verdict was delivered.
Today, we are devastated. The not guilty verdict leaves us with a deep pain of injustice, adding to the unbearable sorrow we felt since Chris was killed. No family should endure the unimaginable grief we have faced since Chris was stolen from us. And this decision shows his life, and many others like him, doesn't matter to the system.
So that was a family clearly upset, clearly still grief-stricken at the loss of Chris Kaba. But did it really show that the system didn't care? Or was it a jury trial where 12 men and women heard the evidence? It was highly unusual for a case like this to be brought to court in the first place and just decided, you know what, there isn't the evidence to prosecute this police officer of murder. Well, let us talk now to Andy Hughes, who has followed the case, investigative reporter at Sky News. And Andy, great to have you with us.
Good to be here.
I mean, we've tried to set it out in 3 minutes, kind of background up to present day. What did we learn about Chris Kaba that we didn't know beforehand?
Well, I'll just start by taking you back to September 2022. And when he was shot, there was understandably a lot of concern amongst the community and the BLM movement, where we're saying that this
Black Lives Matter.
Yes, Black Lives Matter, that this was another George Floyd. So I spoke to a few of my contacts, one who was in gang intelligence in South London, and I said, is this another George Floyd? And he said, this most certainly isn't. This guy, Chris Kaba, and he described him to me as a hitman. He said he is the hitman for one of the most feared and powerful and armed gangs in South London. So that was the information I had straight away. But obviously, knowing how the legal system works, that this information was never going to come out. And then obviously when Martyn Blake, who was known as Annex 121, was charged, this was even more prevalent that this information could not come out at trial. So we were waiting for this day where we could report Chris Kaba's criminal history. Chris Kaba was a prominent member of a gang called 6-7 in Brixton Hill. He was, police believed him to be the most prominent gunman in that gang. He was involved in a assassination attempt of a gang rival a week before he was shot in a nightclub. This person survived, so it was him and his friends were charged with attempted murder. And the night before he was shot, his car was linked to a shooting outside a school in Brixton. So, all of this information has now come out in court after a judge lifted these restrictions.
So, Andy, I mean, this really gives us an insight into how you do your work, because you have to go into court knowing all this stuff, having been told all this stuff. The jury can't possibly know it because every crime is treated individually, so nobody's ever told about a criminal background. But presumably, Martyn Blake would have known this stuff, not when he shot, but afterwards, and presumably the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, would also have known this.
Yeah, that's right. So Martyn Blake was told that this car was linked to a shooting, 2 shootings, and that the gun had not been found. That is why the car was pulled over. That is why the firearms team were following that car and stopped the car. That's all they knew. And the jury was told this information because that's what Martyn Blake knew. His whole criminal history was only known by the wider gang intelligence unit at the Met. Martyn Blake didn't know that. What Martyn Blake knew was told to the jury.
But then the CPS have a case file in front of them, and they're trying to work out, do we bring a prosecution or not? Would this not be material? It wasn't just some random car that was stopped and the police got trigger happy. This was a car that was linked to 2 shootings, as you've just said, that the person inside, I mean, they may not have known then that it was Chris Kaba, but it's kind of not just some passerby on the street who gets pulled over by the cops and is shot.
No, this was a targeted operation. This car was known to be used by senior members of the 6-7 gang, which, as I've said, are a very notorious and dangerous gang.
Given the sensitivities of prosecuting a police officer with murder and the alarm that it caused within firearms officers up and down the country, are you surprised it came to court?
Put it this way, journalists obviously speak outside court, and as crime journalists we cover lots of different cases. One journalist yesterday described it to me as the worst case he's ever seen being brought to court. And another journalist said to me, this is the most obvious not guilty I've ever seen. So that kind of gives you a flavour of what the general feeling was. It was a surprise, certainly by the Met and Martyn Blake's colleagues, that it was brought to court.
And you talked in your first answer about the contacts you have and speaking to them. What do those contacts feel now about what's happened?
Well, it's a mixture of relief and anger. I mean, they say that this case makes it clear, the evidence makes it clear that this should have never been brought to court. On one hand, you have the prosecution case, which was essentially saying that Martyn Blake may have been angry that Chris Kaba wasn't listening to directions and was trying to get away. He may have been doing this, he may have been doing that. On the other hand, the defence's case, which was you had his colleagues basically lining up, saying that they were ready to pull the trigger next. If he hadn't have done it, I would have done. So the strength of the cases was pretty vast.
And what are they saying now? I mean, when you're talking to police officers, firearms officers now, how are they feeling that this trial has impacted their own jobs?
Well, today I've spoken to one of Martyn Blake's colleagues. He has known Martyn for years. He says he's the most professional firearms officer he's ever come across. And he's actually left the force. He left the force pretty much weeks after because of this. He just thought, I'm not doing this anymore. I've had enough of this. And what he says today is that there are no winners in this case. All this has done is made the public perception and the division between the public and the Met and policing a lot greater.
And I guess the flip side, Andy, is if it hadn't been brought to court, what would the public perception, or what would perception in some communities have been then?
Well, exactly, and that's you could argue that's what they were thinking when they brought the case. Let's make a jury decide rather than the authorities themselves. But what it's clearly done is it's upset a lot of people, this case. The IOPC and the police, they've never been friends. But now, I mean, if you ask any...
The IOPC is the watchdog.
The watchdog, which is responsible for investigating the police. I spoke to one senior murder detective today after to get his view, and he said to me, they're out to get us. It's clear they're all out to get us now. This case just shows.
Who's they?
The IOPC.
This is line of duty stuff.
It is absolutely line of duty.
Yeah, it's real life line of duty.
Andy Hughes, it's great to have you in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, let's pick up now with Ken McDonald, who used to be the head of the Crown Prosecution Service before Keir Starmer had that job. And the CPS has really been, I guess, at the heart of most of the questions that people are asking today, whether that trial should ever have been brought. Lord McDonald, nice to talk to you. Let's just start right there, shall we? Would you have brought that case?
Well, I haven't seen the case file, Emily, so it's not really possible for me to say whether I would or I wouldn't. I mean, I can tell you what the test for prosecution is. It's a two-stage test. The prosecutor has to be satisfied, firstly, that there's a realistic prospect of conviction on the evidence. That simply means a better than even chance of a conviction, 51% chance will do, and that the prosecution would be in the public interest. Well, obviously, a prosecution of murder would always be in the public interest. So the question for the prosecutors was, is there a better than even chance of a conviction here? And that's a judgment which prosecutors make all the time. They obviously decided that there was, and as it turned out, there was an acquittal. But an acquittal doesn't mean that it was wrong to bring the case. There are lots of acquittals in the Crown Court, and that's part of our system.
Of course, but the prosecutors would have been aware that he was alleged to have been involved in a shooting the day before, in which someone is kneecapped, effectively. That the car that he was driving was linked to that incident and had been flagged by automatic number plate recognition technology. I mean, doesn't that skew rather in favour? And he is trying to ram his way out of a police, being blocked in. Doesn't that rather suggest that there was a considerable risk of danger and the policeman was acting entirely kind of within the bounds of what was normal?
Well, that was the conclusion of the jury. I mean, the factors that you mentioned are more than a little interesting. The fact that he'd been involved in a shooting, I don't think is so relevant, because the police didn't know that it was Chris Kaba in that car. They knew that the car had been linked to a firearms incident, which would alarm them. And I think the most pertinent factor is the other one you've mentioned, is that he was using the car as a weapon. I mean, there was a police officer on the radio this morning saying, not quite accurate to describe him as unarmed. He was armed with a 2.5-ton Audi, which he was using to ram at the police. So yes, of course. I mean, I think my experience of firearms officers, the experience that I had when I was DPP, was that they were highly professional people, that when they went into operations like this, they were usually scared, very scared, because they never quite know what they're going to find, and they have to make split-second instinctual decisions, and that seems to be what happened here.
So knowing what you know now, and knowing what we've learnt as the court cases unfolded, do you think you would have been more than a little sceptical about bringing the prosecution?
Well, I saw cases like this all the time, and I've occasionally had cases where QCs had advised the prosecution of a firearms officer, which I didn't agree with, and they didn't prosecute. But I'm not really willing to say, John, if you'll forgive me, what I would have done in respect of a case in which I just haven't seen the case papers. I don't think it'd be right for a former DPP to insert his or her view.
So you sound as if you're, without overreading it, you're quite sympathetic to the CPS, and you don't think that there's anything that obviously stands out that suggests they did wrong here, or anything, should I say, that needs to change in the system. Is that right?
From what I've seen of the case, I'm not surprised there was an acquittal, from what I've seen, what I've read in the newspapers. But I would be very surprised if there wasn't, on the papers at least, and cases change at trial, but on the papers at least, a prosecutable case, because a prosecution of a police officer is a very unattractive prosecution for the CPS. It's not something they're leaping to do. It's not something they want to do. It's not something it's at all attractive for a prosecutor to do, for all the obvious reasons. Juries tend to be sympathetic to police. Police officers don't go to work in the morning to murder people. And there are all sorts of reasons why you would think long and hard before bringing a prosecution against a police officer. And I would be very surprised if there weren't factors in this case on the papers that made the decision a compelling one at the time. And it's probably one that was signed off by the DPP, frankly.
Interesting. Okay, so can I put one line to you, which is coming from the police watchdog, the IOPC, that they say the case had been of significant public interest. Is it possible that this was elevated to a trial because people were concerned enough that it had to be seen to be prosecuted? I mean that in the wider sense.
Yeah, well, that would not be a legitimate reason to bring a case. And if that was a reason, it's not the right reason. I'd be surprised if it was that. I would have expected the prosecutors to apply the two tests that I've described to you. Is there a better than evens chance of a conviction here? And is this case in the public interest? Is it in the public interest to prosecute this case? If there was a better than evens chance of a prosecution, then it would clearly be in the public interest to prosecute, because it's such a serious case. Someone lost his life, and it would always be in the public interest to prosecute a murder case. So the real question here for the prosecutors was, is there enough evidence?
Do you think it is right that it is the conventional criminal justice system that deals with something like this? I mean, the case has failed. The jury took 3 hours to acquit. If it's the military, if it was a serving soldier, it would be a court-martial. It wouldn't be the criminal justice system. Do we perhaps need some sort of different architecture for the police?
I've heard this suggested by the police. Actually, most military cases of serious criminal offences now are dealt with in civil courts. They're not dealt with in court-martial. It's only military offences these days that are dealt with in court-martial. Look, the police are not soldiers. I mean, in France, the gendarmerie are a regiment of the French army. They have a different relationship with their police than we do. We view our police officers as being citizens in uniform, and I think it would be deeply damaging for public confidence in the police service if we had a separate justice system for police officers, which was seen to be weighted towards them. There are always two sides to these things. The family and relatives of the person who's been killed are terribly upset. Communities become terribly upset. If we had a system in which the police were treated differently from everybody else, if there was a lower standard of proof, a system which was weighted towards the police not being convicted, I think that would damage public confidence. And I think it is absolutely right. Police should be subject to the same principles of justice as everybody else when they're going about their work. Of course, that also means, though, that prosecutors have to take into account the particular sensitivities and difficulties that armed officers find themselves in, because the whole point about self-defense is, did you believe that this was what you reasonably needed to do to protect yourself? So it's all about the subjective belief. And frankly, the fact that the police officer is in that sort of situation, facing that sort of danger, is something that has to be factored in by prosecutors when they're making charging decisions. But yes, the police should face, in my view, the same justice system as everybody else.
Ken McDonald, really good to talk to you. Thank you for explaining it all so clearly.
Okay.
So that was really interesting talking to Ken McDonald, who's been there, done it. I kind of
done it just before Keir Starmer took over.
Yeah, and I came to a rather different conclusion to you in that interview, because when you said to him, you seemed to be suggesting that it was right to bring the case. I thought he was rather implying when he said, I'm not surprised it only took 3 hours for the jury to reach a verdict. He was sort of saying it was kind of pretty thin, the case that was brought against this police sergeant.
But it needed to be brought. I mean, I thought he did defend the CPS for making the decision that they had made, because he kept on giving us that threshold. Has to be above 51% chance of prosecution. He obviously hasn't seen the papers. He told us that, many times. But he believes that they had reasons to think that... I mean, that definition of murder was new to me, right? So any moment in which they discharge the weapon, knowing that it could cause serious harm and not actually having their life in danger, would, I think, from what he was saying, constitute enough of a reason to bring that case.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I bet you within the CPS there is a pretty rigorous post-match searching of the decisions made and were they the right decisions, and naming the police officer as well.
Well, let's bring in Frank Ferguson, who's the current head of the CPS, who says this has been a complex and sensitive case. The decision to prosecute was made after an in-depth consideration of all the available evidence. We recognise firearms officers operate under enormous pressure, but it's our responsibility to put case before a jury to meet our test prosecution. We're satisfied that test was met in this case. You might be right. Beneath the waves, they might be going, oh God, we're going to get a huge backlash over this, particularly if more and more police officers start handing in their firearms or leaving the force. But they have to publicly say, we absolutely met the threshold on this, and that's why it was brought.
Of course. I did wonder, you asked the question and it was batted away about there was such public interest, did you have to?
Yes.
And the awareness of kind of the clamour for justice or whatever, you always wonder, does that play a part in the decision making of...
Even subliminally,
thinking, just someone thinking, geez, can you imagine the shit we're going to take if we don't do something? If we say there's nothing to see here,
completely.
Move along.
I think that's exactly where we're going to pick up after the break, because we're talking to Babu, who is the former head of Gold Command, who knows what firearms officers go through, but he's going to give us his sense of what this is doing to policing community relations and the sense within the police forces themselves. Well, Andy was taking us through what it's like to report on a case like that, and Ken McDonald was talking us through how the CPS comes to make their decisions. But we're going to talk now to Babu, who's a former Met Police Superintendent and Gold Firearms Commanding Officer, to get, I guess, a little bit more of the wider context of how the force is feeling, what community relations are like, and how those decisions are made, because you've been right at the heart of the force when you know how little time you have to decide whether to fire a shot or not.
Yeah, well, I think there's three key issues here. One is around the trust in the police, not from just the black community, but from the community generally. I think there was times when that trust was limited to black, Asian, LGBTQ2 young people, but it's no longer the case. I was at a dinner party, middle-aged women in their 60s saying, we don't trust the police.
Did that shock you?
Yeah, it is. So you've got white, heterosexual, middle-class women saying, we don't trust the police. Wayne Couzens, just where you had a police officer kidnap a woman and rape her and murder her. So those kind of things have shook the foundations of trust in the police. So I think trust is a key element to this, because people have their own narratives. People have their own idea of what happened. I think the second issue is around the IOPC, the Independent Office of Police Conduct. They carried out this investigation. I don't know what their investigators, what knowledge and understanding their investigators have of firearms events, how quickly these decisions are made, the complexity of these decisions, the intelligence that you gather, how things change very, very quickly.
You think they got it wrong?
I think they did. I think, they would have presented the papers and then the CPS would have made the decision. I just struggle to understand how they've come, because murder is a high bar. It's malice aforethought. It's premeditated. So you're looking at a very, very high bar.
So that's such an interesting answer, Dal. Do you think that public pressure, the need to answer a community's concerns about the death of this person, could have played a part in the decision making? Because presumably it shouldn't be public opinion that determines whether a case is brought. It should be the basis of the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel there's pressure on the IOPC to deliver this situation where they recommended a murder charge. And I think that was then presented to the CPS. But it's not. It doesn't seem to be based on evidence. I've yet to meet a person in the criminal justice system who says actually that was an appropriate charge and it's likely to be successful. And it might have had the exact opposite effect of what it intended to do. If they were trying to ensure that the community had more trust, having gone through this process and then had a not guilty verdict, it would probably damage trust even more in the police.
You can understand a world in which they say, we have got so many unsolved murders of young black men, we cannot afford to not be seen to be absolutely on top of this.
I think that's a key element. And the third point I was going to make is that the police struggle with understanding equality, but particularly race. You know, if you go back to the history of policing, 58 Notting Hill riots, you go to Scarman 81, you go to Stephen Lawrence 98, you then go to
Damilona Taylor.
And then, you know, if you look at Louise Casey's report,
Exactly.
they all essentially say the same thing. But what happens is the police can't get their head around putting the recommendations in place. The 70 recommendations for the Stephen Lawrence inquiry were not all implemented. And I think the danger is that we end up having inquiry after inquiry, but we don't have the understanding, the awareness in the senior ranks to...
Do you under Mark Rowley now?
I think under policing generally, I think they really struggle. There's no acknowledgement of institutional racism. We've had people who've been in the governance of the Metropolitan Police denying that institutional racism exists. So I think there's a real challenge here. So you can understand why there's this lack of trust in the police service, but I think it then has an impact on the day-to-day delivery of policing.
So how do you navigate something like the shooting of Chris Kaba, where by all accounts he was a gang member, he'd been implicated in other shootings, the car was known to have been at the scene of 2 other shootings, he's trying to force his way out of a roadblock, police marksman, armed police officer takes a shot, kills him. How do you navigate that?
Well, I think it's devastating when somebody loses their life. But I think because there's a lack of trust, because there's a fundamental lack of trust in policing, you know, people don't sit down and have that rational conversation. You end up with being in one camp or the other camp. And you know, people have criticised me. I always try and look at the evidence, you know, and sometimes I'll be very supportive of the police, sometimes I'll be supportive of the community. But, you know, what we know as a fact is that the judge bent over backwards in court to exclude bad character evidence. The judge could have decided, actually, we're going to include all those things. You know, Chris Kaba's membership of the drill group 67, Chris Kaba's sort of previous conviction. He was sentenced for possession of a firearm, 4 years. He's the fact that he was on.
I mean, do you think juries should know that stuff, Dal? Because we've all the principle of justice in this country has always been that you don't discuss criminal records, you don't discuss former criminal behaviour. Do you think that's wrong?
You know, I don't think that's wrong. I think it's the right thing to do. But I think in these circumstances, what the police wanted to do was introduce the wider picture around Chris Kaba, and they were denied that opportunity by the judge. I think that we have to respect that opinion.
Can I just ask, wouldn't that make it even more likely that you'd bring a prosecution if police knew the man who was in the car and knew he was a gang leader? Because we don't shoot gang leaders, even if they're gang leaders. That's not what we do in this country.
If the police had known, because the intelligence is really important to understand, is that there was a PNC marker, a firearms marker on the vehicle, on the Audi that Chris Kaba was driving, and that was indicating that the vehicle had been involved in criminal activity. We know what we don't know, and what the police officers, I suspect, didn't know, who was driving that vehicle at the time. But Chris Kaba, as you indicated, was involved in a shooting in Hackney and was a member of Drills 67, the violent criminal group.
Oh, you've talked about the distrust of the police force by the community. What about within the police service itself and the way they feel victimised as well? Because I think there are an awful lot of firearms officers today who think, my God, our job's bloody impossible now because we can't do it. And the chances are, if we're in a very stressful situation and you kind of hear the sound of that hard stop and the orders, that the stress in their voices, you can tell. Then they're going to think, I'm going to be hung out to dry.
Well, I think they've been vindicated, haven't they? Because it's gone through the criminal justice process and they've not been found guilty. And you could argue whether that case should ever have been brought. But I recall when I had a couple of officers shot, I'd gone into work. I mean, it was in some ways it was very, very comical. In other ways, very, very serious. I was very, very nervous about doing this firearms operation, Operation Neon. You'd be with moving vehicles. You'd have people from all over across London, and we were trying to get gangsters that were involved in shootings within nightclubs. In some ways, a similar kind of situation to what Chris Kaba was suspected of being involved in. And I remember going out for a run, and I went for a 9-mile run. I was so nervous. I was just trying to get these nerves out of me before I went into work. When I got home, my wife and my daughter had gone out shopping, and this was pre-mobile phones, so I couldn't get in the house. So I remember sitting around at neighbours' houses and then until they came back, and then getting ready and then going into work. And I'd not had the opportunity of having a sleep and I was already very, very nervous. And I went in, and that day 2 of my officers got shot, and we had a hostage situation. And I remember the impact on my family. My daughter was standing at the front window because she'd heard there's been a shooting, and I came home about 24 hours later after I'd gone into work, and she didn't know what had happened. So it causes a huge amount of stress on families. And I think what you've had with police officers have been quite angry that this information was not allowed in the court case, but they're also angry at the perception that they are not professional. I mean, the reality is we are not like America. We do not have police officers shooting guns on a regular basis. So you have 4 shots in a year.
Yeah.
4 shots in a... Sorry.
So 18,000 operations across England and Wales, and shots were fired on four occasions. And some occasions, no shots are fired. Or some years, not a single shot is fired by a firearms officer.
So, Dal, if you're Mark Rowley now, if you're the head of the Met Police, what do you do? Because on the one hand, you've got this real problem with morale amongst the ranks. People handing back their guns, handing in their badges sometimes, saying, why would I want to go through this? I don't want to be on trial for murder for defending the British Republic and my colleagues. And on the other hand, you're saying he should be weeding out the racism in the Met to stop these, kind of shootings in the first place. And he's not doing that because he refused to even recognise institutional racism.
I would suggest that Mark Rowley needs to acknowledge institutional racism. A number of other forces have done that. So if you go to Police Scotland, you go to Avon and Somerset, you go to the head of the Police Federation, prominent individuals within policing have done that.
But doesn't that even kill public trust more and lower morale more?
Well, I think it's understanding what institutional racism is. It's not about individuals. It's about processes and procedures. And if the story has now become, in some ways, the failure of the Metropolitan Police to acknowledge institutional racism. And I think that would have been, when Louise Casey is a huge supporter of the police. Yeah. And she's quite a phenomenal individual. You have got people who are, very, very pro-police, saying, look, these are the issues. And you don't solve issues unless you recognise what your problem is. So I think it's quite frustrating that we're in this situation. But going to your point around how do you deal with the dilemma of ensuring that the community has confidence and the police are held to account, I think there's some tough decisions that have to be made. I just feel frustrated that we are still talking about the lack of trust, because fundamentally this issue is about lack of trust in the police, because certain sections of the community and the wider community will have their own narrative about what happened on that day.
Babu, it's really brilliant to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Before we go, Arnold Palmer was one of the greatest golfers of his generation. He won the Masters a number of times, the Open, US Open. He kind of had major titles like Tiger Woods today. He was from Pennsylvania, as you know, a key swing state in this election. And Donald Trump wanted to pay tribute to this great golfer. But it wasn't his golf that he wanted to talk about.
But Arnold Palmer was all man, and I say that in all due respect to women, and I love women. But this is a guy that was all man. This man was strong and tough. And I refuse to say it, but when he took showers with the other pros, they came out of there, they said, oh my God. That's
Donald Trump there introducing us to the manhood of Arnold Palmer. And what we should explain, that those two lines came at the end of a rally speech with an Arnold Palmer anecdote spanning, I think, about 25 minutes. I watched the whole thing. And the question is this stuff working for Donald Trump? And if so, what does Kamala Harris do about it? We'll be discussing all that and much more with an independent, non-partisan pollster in our episode of the News Agency USA.
So that's enough of manhood and Arnold Palmer's schlong. We will be in the...
That was just so gratuitous.
Well, Donald Trump was talking about it. I didn't introduce the subject. It was Donald Trump who chose to raise Arnold Palmer's. He also said that he used very stiff shafts, talking about golf clubs, of course.
Okay, you're loving this. He's enjoying it too much. Can we just go? Just cut him off. Cut him off, somebody. Bye.
We'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.